Thank you very much, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, members of this committee. Your bipartisan support, your visits to Ukraine, the assistance you have provided have been absolutely essential to the American goal of supporting Ukraine's democratic European future. Before I begin today, let's just take a moment, if we may, to honor the sacrifice of Ukrainian pilot and RADA deputy Nadia Savchenko, who was seized in Ukraine in 2014, dragged across the Russian border, and unjustly held and tried in Russia. Today, her hunger strike continues as the court in Rostov again delays an announcement of its verdict. Nadia's struggle is a stark reminder of the pressures Ukraine continues to face, even as it works to build a stronger, more resilient country for its citizens. I want to thank this committee for its continued focus on Nadia Savchenko and all Ukraine's hostages, and for the passage of Senate Resolution 52. We call on Russia to release her immediately and return her to Ukraine and to her family before it's too late. Like Nadia, all across Ukraine, citizens are standing up and sacrificing for the universal values that bind us as a transatlantic community, for sovereignty, for territorial integrity, for human rights and dignity, for clean and accountable government, and for justice for all. The United States has stood by Ukraine as Russia has sought to stymie its democratic rebirth at every turn. Today, however, as you both mentioned, Ukraine's European future is put at risk as much by enemies within as by external forces. The oligarchs and kleptocrats who controlled Ukraine for decades know that their business model will be broken if Maidan reformers succeed in 2016. So they're fighting back with a vengeance, using all the levers of the old system, their control of the media, state-owned enterprises, RADA deputies, the courts, and the political machinery, while holding old loyalties and threats over the heads of decision-makers to block change. Against this backdrop, Ukraine's own leaders have been locked for months in a cycle of political infighting and indecision about how to restore unity, trust, and effectiveness in the reform coalition, and how to reboot the government and its program. Every week that Ukraine drifts internally, that reform is stalled, IMF and international support goes undispersed, and those inside and outside the country who preferred the old Ukraine grow more confident. The ability of the United States and the international community to continue to support Ukraine depends upon the commitment of its leaders to put their country and their people first. So all those who call themselves reformers in Ukraine have to work harder now to rebuild consensus behind a leadership team and an IMF and EU compliant program of aggressive measures to clean up corruption, restore justice, and liberalize the economy. We continue to believe that 2016 can and should be the year that Ukraine breaks free from the unholy alliance of dirty money and dirty politics, which has ripped off Ukrainians for far too long. But without that, Ukraine risks sliding backwards once again into corruption, into lawlessness, into vassal statehood. But here's the good news. Since I last testified before this committee about 5 months ago, Ukraine has stabilized its currency. It's rebuilding its reserves. It passed its first winter without relying on Gazprom gas. It approved a 2016 budget that's in line with IMF requirements. It passed civil service reform. It broke its own record for wheat exports. It stood up an anti-corruption bureau and a special prosecutor. And it began to decentralize power and budget authority to local communities. The very week that, in February, that the current government survived a no-confidence vote, RADA deputies also approved 5 critical pieces of legislation to stay on track with IMF conditions and EU requirements for their bid for visa-free travel, and they passed another piece of legislation just today. U.S. assistance has been critical to all of these efforts. As you said, Mr. Ranking Member, we've committed over $760 million in assistance so far, plus 2 $1 billion loan guarantees, and U.S. advisors serve in almost a dozen Ukrainian ministries and localities, helping to deliver services, eliminate fraud and abuse, improve tax collection, and modernize Ukrainian institutions. With U.S. help, newly vetted and trained police officers are patrolling the streets of 18 Ukrainian cities. In courtrooms across Ukraine, free legal aid attorneys funded by the U.S. have won 2/3 of all the acquittals in the countries. Treasury and State Department advisors have helped Ukraine shutter over 60 failed banks and protected the assets of depositors. And since there can be no reform in Ukraine without security, over $266 million of our support has been in the security sector, training 1,200 soldiers and 750 Ukrainian National Guard personnel, and supplying life-saving gear. In FY16, we are continuing that training and equipment of more of Ukraine's border guards, military, and Coast Guard. But it is urgent that Ukrainian President Poroshenko, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, and the leaders of the Rada come together now behind a government and a reform program that deliver what the Maidan demanded: clean leadership, justice, an end to zero-sum politics and backroom deals, and public institutions that serve Ukraine's citizens rather than impoverishing them or exploiting them. In 2016, our U.S. assistance program, with your generous support, is designed to support all of these priorities. Specifically, we will support Ukraine as it takes further steps to clean up its energy sector, to appoint and confirm a clean and new prosecutor general who's committed to rebuilding the integrity of the PGO and indicting and prosecuting the corrupt, as it takes steps to improve the business climate and move ahead with privatization of state-owned enterprises and strengthen the banking system and strengthen judicial independence, and to improve services and eliminate graft in areas that affect every Ukrainian, including healthcare, education, transportation, and also to modernize the Ministry of Defense. Of course, Ukraine's greatest challenge remains the ongoing occupation of its territory in Crimea and Donbass, and its effort to restore sovereignty in the East through the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. These agreements, we believe, remain the best hope for peace. Last time I came before this committee, Ukraine was in a better place. The September 1st ceasefire had largely silenced the guns, and some Ukrainians were even beginning to go back to Donbass. But as you both have said, today things are heating up again. We've seen a spike in ceasefire violations, taking the lives of 68 Ukrainian military personnel and injuring 317. In February alone, the OSCE monitors reported 15,000 violations, the vast majority of which originated from the separatist-controlled side of the line of contact. And despite President Putin's commitment to the other Normandy leaders, Russia and separatist forces continued to deny OSCE monitors access to large swaths of the Donbass. At the early March meeting of Normandy foreign ministers, Ukraine supported concrete steps to pull back forces from the line of contact, to increase OSCE monitors and equipment in key hotspots, and to establish more OSCE bases deeper in the Donbass and on the border. Taking these steps now and releasing hostages would greatly improve the environment for compromise in Kyiv on election modalities and political rights for Donbass. In the meantime, though, neither Moscow nor the self-appointed Donbass authorities should expect the Ukrainian Rada to take up key outstanding political provisions of Minsk, including election modalities and constitutional amendments, before the Kremlin and its proxies meet their basic security obligations under Minsk. Here again, with will and effort on all sides, 2016 could be a turning point year for Ukraine. If security can improve in the coming weeks, if more hostages can be returned, if the parties can finalize the negotiations on the political issues of Minsk, we could see legitimate leaders elected in free, fair elections in Donbass by the fall, and the withdrawal of Russian forces and equipment, and the return of Ukraine's sovereignty over its border before the end of the year. We will keep working with Ukraine to do its part to implement Minsk, and working with our European partners to assure that Russia stays under sanctions until it does its part, all of it. And of course, Crimea sanctions must remain in place so long as the Kremlin imposes its will on that piece of Ukrainian land. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of this committee, we always knew that Ukraine's road to peace and sovereignty, to clean and accountable government, and to Europe would not be easy. Today, the stakes are as high as ever. With strong leadership in Kyiv, 2016 can and should be a turning point year for Ukraine's sovereignty and its European future. If and as Ukraine's leaders recommit to drive the country forward, the United States must be there to support them. At the same time, we must be no less rigorous than the Ukrainian people themselves in demanding that Kyiv's leaders take their own responsibility now and deliver a truly clean, strong, just Ukraine while they still have the chance. I thank this committee for its support for Ukraine and for a Europe whole, free, and at peace. I look forward to answering your questions.